Hey guys, it is finally that time of year where we look back on 2024 and do our annual Gumball Awards. This is now the third year I've done this type of video where I look back at all the Survivor and Big Brother seasons that we covered in the past year and really see what the best moments are and the best aspects from all those seasons are, which should be for an interesting video, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we got several awards to give out, and let's waste some more time. Let's grab with the actual video. So the first award we have is for Best Tribe, and I decided to go with one nominee for each of the Survivor seasons we cover this year. So first up, from Australian Survivor, we do have the Rebels Tribe, and I actually debated which one to go with here between the Titans and Rebels group. And I feel like the Rebels tribe was a bit more interesting, as I feel like I have bigger characters with the likes of Ferris and Kirby really carrying the day here. Even Raymond had his moments at points, even though there was some wonkiness there. But in the end, I decided to not give the award to them because I feel like there were other people on that tribe that simply weren't as interesting. People like PETA, Tobias, for instance. Even Sarah was kind of a dud. So I feel like it kind of has the trappings of a normal Australian Survivor season to where I did not give the award to them. And the other nominee is the Lavo tribe from Survivor 47. As admittedly, I think this group had a bit more interesting people in there. You have the likes of Teeny, for instance, who was pretty likable. Asia was obviously a pretty prominent presence there. But in the end, I feel like the likes of Rome dragged it down. I kind of found Rome annoying, to be honest, so I didn't give the award to them. But in the end, I decided to give this award to the Yanu tribe from Survivor 46. Now, admittedly, I think the Yanu tribe is kind of a mixed bag as well, to where people like Banu, for instance, can definitely get on people's nerves at points, but I feel like Banu was at least an early enough boot to where he couldn't really drag down the season too much. Not to mention his actual arc across the season was at least somewhat interesting, having this rise and fall, him going through the 5 stages of grief, to where I figured it was just enough to make them the winners here, even though Yanu's not my favorite tribe in Survivor history by any means, but they were good enough to win this award here. Next up, we have the Worst Tribe Award, and sort of similar to the Best Tribe Award, I decided to go with one nominee per season here. So let's start off with the Titans tribe from Titans vs. Rebels, and this was more so a default here due to the Rebels being nominated for Best Tribe. However, I decided to not give them the award here, as I feel like there are still plenty of good characters on the Titans tribe. People like Eden, for instance, were pretty interesting. I think Mark also had his moments, even early on, like the fact that the big alpha males in that tribe, like Frankie and Nathan, were on the bottom, was at least interesting enough to where they couldn't get the award. But I still feel like there was other duds on the cast, people like Charles, for instance, that didn't really bring that much to the table here. And then the other nominee was the Tuku tribe, which was my choice from Survivor 47. And again, I feel like they're not that bad either. I think there are some okay characters across the board here, but admittedly, they were still my least favorite tribe from that season. I feel like I didn't really connect as well with the characters on there. People like Gabe, people like Sue, for instance. Even Caroline is someone who I was a bit underwhelmed by their content on the actual show, so I feel like I couldn't quite give the award to them. So in the end, I decided to give the award to Siga from Survivor 46. And admittedly, I don't think Siga is the worst tribe in the world either, to where I still think there are some interesting people in there. I think Charlie is a fine enough character, not like a big character, but likable enough and a decent player. Even Tim Spicer, while again, not the most interesting character in the world, at least it was funny, like getting to say his name, and also the fact that he was relatively under-edited on the show. But beyond that, I feel like they were just simply the tribe that I was the least invested in across the actual season. I feel like they were kind of a boring tribe during a lot of the pre-merge. And then even after the merge, there were some people there that I just didn't really connect with as well. People like Mariah, for instance. Even Maria can be a bit annoying with how egotistical she was. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I didn't connect with them as well as the others, to where I decided to give the award to them. Next up, we have my favorite character award, and this actually will include some Big Brother people as well here, and we do have several nominees to get into here, but first up we have Andy from 47, who I feel like had a pretty interesting arc across the actual season, with him starting off as his underdog, someone who came in as this massive super fan, only for him to be kind of messy, but kind of turn it around by the end of it, and had some pretty funny moments along the way, like some of the stuff he would do during the challenges. You have his big meltdown in episode 1, but I feel like it wasn't really enough to give him the award there. Next up, from Australian Survivor, we do have Kirby, and I think Kirby was a pretty fun presence across the actual season, mainly because of how aggressive of a player she was, which I wasn't really expecting coming into it, considering she didn't really know the game as well as other people, but she was still a very aggressive player, someone who was willing to make moves that not many people would be willing to do, especially early on this season. And I feel like that alone makes her a pretty fascinating character, but not enough to give her the award there. And then moving over to the Big Brother side, I actually had a couple considerations. Where first up, you have Angela from BB26, who is obviously a pretty massive character across the season, pretty big presence on the feeds, pretty big presence on the actual show, and has some pretty fun moments along the way. But I feel like she kind of got grading at points. I feel like the show kind of like laid it on a bit too thick with how big of a character she was. So I feel like by the end, I couldn't quite give her the award. Next up, we have Joseph, also from BB26, who admittedly is someone I have a bit of a soft spot for, considering he was a pretty big fan, but also someone who had a pretty fun arc across the season with him thinking he was a much better player than what he actually was, him thinking he was like this Dr. Will figure, and had a pretty fun downfall by the end of it, but not quite enough to give him the award. And then the other nominee is Spicy V from BB Can. And again, I think Spicy V was at least a consideration, as she is one of the biggest characters in all of Big Brother Canada. But at the end of the day, she's not my personal favorite. She's not my personal cup of tea. So I didn't quite give her the award, but was at least worthy of a mention here. But in the end, I decided to give the award to Q from Survivor 46. And I think Q was just a really fun character across the actual season here. Someone who definitely had like this weird dichotomy between him, like wanting to play a really aggressive game, definitely someone who's outspoken, but also wanting to quit whenever he faces adversity, which we saw in the pre-merge after losing the immunity challenge, after the merge when he wants to quit the game there, kind of blows up his spot there. And then obviously you have the old Applebee's situation, which also contributed to his character. I just think Q's a really funny character. I could watch him really during a lot of the season, and he's someone who I would be pretty excited to see back on Survivor 50, but we'll see if he ends up getting cast. But I feel like considering the amount of moments he has across the season, while not really getting as grading as people like Rome for 47, I feel like it was enough to give Q the award here. Next up, we have my favorite moment, and really there were only two considerations I had here. But first, we'll talk about the one that didn't get the award, and that is Liz's meltdown from Survivor 46 after not being chosen for the Applebee's reward. Again, this is a pretty iconic moment and a pretty funny one, with Liz like having like this really massive reaction to not being picked for the reward, having some funny lines here, like talking about how she's pissed and how she sees Q eat every day. And again, I think this is a pretty funny moment here. Even carrying over to the actual reward, you have like this really funny music playing as they're enjoying the burger. And this coming almost immediately after Liz gets her personal content, which was meant to make us feel a little bad for her. So I feel like that juxtaposition makes it pretty funny here. But I feel like this is definitely the highlight from the Survivor side of things. But in the end, I decided to give the award to a Big Brother moment, and that is Angela's speech in week 1 of BB26, where she calls out Matt in front of the kitchen. And again, I feel like this is a really iconic moment as well. I watched this live on the live feeds, and it was just really funny seeing it all play out across the 10 minutes. And I think the show does it plenty of justice as well. And again, I feel like there's so many funny moments, so many funny lines here. Like Angela saying how this is a great performance for a low budget movie. You have her calling Matt crazy eyes multiple times. You have her saying, except you, don't talk to me. And the fact that Angela is acting like this underdog when she was the HOH in week 1. Again, it's all really funny in my personal eyes. And I feel like while there are many great Angela moments across the season, I think this one is easily the most iconic for me. And I feel like it's easily my answer for my favorite moment from the year. Next up, we have the Best Move Award, and admittedly, I didn't really have any honorable mentions here. I feel like there are plenty of fine moments here and there, but I feel like while there are a decent amount of good players across the Survivor and Big Brother seasons, I feel like there isn't really a signature move that a lot of them make here. So in the end, I decided to give the award to probably the flashiest move I've seen across the year, and that is the Final 9 round of Australian Survivor Titans vs. Rebels, where Raymond and Ferris successfully idle out Valeria here. Now, admittedly, this isn't like a game-defining move by any means. It's not really one that causes Ferris to win the game here, but it's probably the flashiest move across the actual season here, where Raymond spends a lot of the round acting like he's about to quit the game and really just trying to draw the votes onto him. And it's pretty successful, where the majority of the tribe ends up voting him out, thinking that he's about to quit the game and they're doing him a favor, only for him to pull out his idol at the last opportunity, negating all the votes and taking out Valeria with just a single vote here. Now, from a pure gameplay perspective, is this really the best move of the season? Not really, but I think it's probably like the flashiest one. And at the end of the day, I feel like it's probably one of the most memorable ones across the actual season here. And considering it does ultimately benefit Ferris, who later goes on to win the season by keeping around a number, and Raymond, who was one of his allies by that point, I do feel like it's still a pretty fun move, and definitely one that I think was definitely worthy of this award. Next up, we have the worst move of the year, and actually did not consider any Survivor seasons for this, as I feel like the main considerations were all from the Big Brother side of things. but I do have two nominees here. One then coming from BB26, and that is Tucker not using the veto on himself. Now, there's obviously a bunch of moves you can say with Tucker here, as Tucker played a pretty bad game for the most part, and even with his move to not use the veto here, you can argue that a lot of it is because he simply got bored in the house and he didn't really try that hard to play the game by that point. But obviously, it's still pretty notable when someone wins the veto in a spot to where they're in danger, but not using it on themselves, which is obviously pretty bad. But again, considering the context of the move, I didn't think it was the worst move in the world here, but it was still worthy of a consideration. But in the end, I decided to give the award to Big Brother Canada 12, and this is Vivek backdooring Dennis in week 3. And this is obviously a pretty bad move here, considering Vivek won the HOH in a spot to where they were at the bottom of the house, was going to be targeted that week had they not won HOH, only for them to later backdoor his own closest ally, which is all pretty bad there. Doesn't really do him any favors there, and while he is taken out in wonky circumstances the following week, it still doesn't take away from how actively bad of a move this is at the end of the day. And while there are other things you can point to that could be arguably worse moves here, I do feel like this is still a pretty bad one, definitely one that was at least worthy of the award here. Next up, we have the Surprise Breakout Award, and I usually give this award to a player that I was pretty low on in the preseason, but they ended up doing pretty well across the actual game that they ended up playing here. And there were a few considerations here for the award. There were definitely some people that definitely surprised me here, where first up you have Charlie from Survivor 46, who I did kind of have around the middle of the pack coming into Survivor 46 on the preseason power ranking, only for him to do pretty well, play a pretty dominant game, and come pretty close to winning, which is all pretty good there. You also have Genevieve from Survivor 47, who I was also pretty low on the preseason, not because I thought they were the worst player in the world on paper, but because I just thought they were going to be an early boot, and I even thought they were going to be an early boot for the first couple of weeks of the actual season, only for them to later break out and play a somewhat impressive game, even though they don't win by the end of it. And on a similar note, we do have Rachel, the winner of Survivor 47, who I kind of thought similarly to Genevieve, someone who I thought could have been sniped out as an early boot, but ended up winning by the end of it, even though their actual winning game is pretty questionable, but they still technically won the game. They still technically exceeded my expectations there. But in the end, I decided to not give any of them the award, as I feel like there were definitely signs in the preseason of them being competent players. It was just me being uncertain over whether it was actually going to pan out or if they were going to be taken out due to preconceived notions about them. But in the end, I decided to give the award to Mark from Australian Survivor Titans vs. Rebels, who I did have towards the bottom of my preseason power ranking for Titans vs. Rebels, only for them to get all the way to the final 3. Now, they still played a very rocky game across the season where there were points where they were on the outs and on the bottom, but I still think they were able to be a lot better socially than I thought of them coming into it, where I thought that considering they were this politician, that they were going to come out really schemy and be an early lead because of that. But they still ended up building allies. They still ended up being way better socially than I thought. And I feel like that alone is pretty impressive in my eyes, to where I feel like they were the pretty clear option here for the Surprise Breakout. Next up, we have the Surprise Disappointment Award, which is pretty much the opposite of the Surprise Breakout Award. These are players who I was high on in the preseason, but ended up doing pretty poorly and ended up being early boots as a result here. And similar to the Surprise Breakout Award, there were several nominees here, definitely several misses along the way. Where first up you have Matt from BB26, who I was somewhat high on in the preseason of BB26, as he felt like this pretty stereotypical, athletic male that you would normally expect to do well here, only for him to be the first boot of the season and for him to play a pretty actively bad game that caused him to be a target as early as he was. And while I could say that he got unlucky by the week 1 HOH, being Angela, someone who was a bit more likely to go after him, I still think at the end of the day, there were definitely signs of him being a pretty bad player to where he ended up being an early boot there. Next up from Survivor 47, there were 2 nominees here, where the first one was TK. Similar thing to Matt, where you would expect him to do pretty well on Survivor, be able to get to the merge without too much difficulty, only for him to be the first one out of his tribe in the second boot of the season, and a lot of that due to his pretty bad social play there. Again, similar deal to Matt in the sense that he was someone you would expect to at least make the merge on the season, only for him to be an early boot, which is all pretty bad there. And then you also have Asia Welch from 47, who was his pretty big preseason favorite, only for her to be an early boot there. And I did think she had a shot based off her preseason press, where it seemed like she was going to be pretty well liked on her tribe and someone who was going to be pretty well positioned there. And to be fair, she was able to build some bonds there with the likes of Teeny, for instance, only for it to not really pan out there. The reason I did not give Asia the award, though, is even though I was pretty high on her after the preseason press, there was still this worry in the back of my head that she was going to be this early boot regardless, to where I wasn't entirely surprised when she was still booted early, but definitely not something that was reflected on the preseason power ranking. But ultimately, I think the main contenders here come from Titans versus Rebels here, where I feel like there were some pretty notable misses here in terms of preseason expectations here. Where first up, you have Nathan. Again, similar deal to Matt and TK, this big athletic guy that you would normally expect to do well, especially on Australian Survivor, which is this pretty physical show that definitely favors people like Nathan, only for him to be on the bottom right from the start and for him to be an early boot regardless. And on a similar note, you have PETA, someone who I kind of saw similar to like some of these more under the radar female winners we've seen on Australian Survivor. People like Pia from Champions versus Contenders 2. I felt like Pia could have definitely fit into that role, only for her to be an early boot as well. So obviously that's pretty bad. But in the end, the award here was pretty uncontested in my eyes. And the award goes to Frankie from Titans versus Rebels here, who is probably the biggest miss I've had on this channel, at least when it comes to my winner picks, where she was my winner pick coming into Titans versus Rebels, only for her to be the first boot here, which is all pretty funny there. Again, plays a pretty bad game for the most part. It seemed like she definitely did things to make herself the target here. And while it was pretty unfortunate that she was kind of lumped in with like these jocks that end up on the bottom, the original Titans tribe, I still feel like the fact that you have like this big difference between me having her as the winner pick coming to the season, only for her to be the first boot, was such a clear indication to me that the award should go to her. Next up, we have the Worst Survivor Player Award, and this was definitely a tough category. I feel like there were some pretty bad players across the Survivor seasons here. And again, I did have a bit of deliberation in deciding who to actually give this award to here. Now, first up, I did consider TK, who, as I mentioned earlier, had no reason to be as early a boot as he was, but ended up doing so anyway. But in the end, I feel like he's not as actively bad as certain other players. And I think even with his bad social play, there's still a world where he could make the merge in certain situations, considering his pure physical strength. So I feel like that alone was enough to not give him the award, but he was at least a consideration here. I also considered Kelly from Titans vs. Rebels, who I think is definitely a pretty bad player, someone who's pretty bad socially, someone who is pretty clearly on the outs for almost the entire season. And obviously, there's very little to praise with Kelly. But the reason I did not give her the award, however, is she does technically make it far considering how bad of a player she is, where she does come one round away from making it to the merge. And plus, she does survive several tribals before her eventual boot here, where she does technically survive 3 tribals before eventually being voted out there, voting correctly across all of them, which is all pretty good there. Now, mind you, she does survive a non-elimination round, where she was technically voted out of her tribe in episode 5, but was swapped over there for an episode. She also had the whole Tobias situation where she was supposed to vote for Alex there as part of a vote split, only for her to flip her vote for seemingly no good reason. And I do think there's still plenty of bad with Kelly, but the fact that she was technically voting alongside Kirby for a lot of the early game was enough to not give her the award, even though I still very much considered it. And the other person I considered was Banu from Survivor 46, and Banu was pretty close to getting the award here. However, there were a couple of reservations that I had where, for one, he does technically survive a couple tribals. He survives 2 tribals before his eventual boot, voting correctly at the Jelinski and Jess rounds. At least that's something worth mentioning. There was also a point where you had Q wanting to work with him, and while he does drive Q away, I think the fact that Q was at least willing to work with him was at least something worth considering here. And I also think Banu's a competent challenge competitor to where I think that alone could also keep him safe in certain situations here. So I do think there are a couple of redeeming qualities to Banu. But I think beyond that, I think he's a pretty bad player. I don't think he's really suited to play the game of Survivor, considering he's not really willing to lie to people. He's not willing to really vote people out at many opportunities. And I think he's someone who I would have almost no faith in on any given season, but it's those few redeeming qualities that keep him from getting this award. But in the end, considering these options, I did decide to give the award to Jessica from Titans vs. Rebels. And I think Jessica is another pretty bad player, someone who I would have almost no faith on any given season. And she is the earliest boot out of all the people we consider here, being the second boot of the season, and in a spot to where she was considered to be the first boot in the first round, where she was the secondary target to the Frankie and Nathan side here. Now, you could say that she does survive that round in a spot to where the rest of the tribe was actively defending her and that they want to make the stand against the more traditional alpha players that dominate Australian Survivor. But really, when you think about it, I don't think any of them really cared that much about Jessica. They didn't really care about her at all. And we literally see that in the second round where they're just so willing to vote her out at the next tribal, where she ends up trying to target Eden, who was the main person orchestrating the Frankie vote that saved her at the first round. And I feel like Jessica's a pretty bad player, someone who I think doesn't really connect with many people, someone who I feel like I don't really have much faith in on any given season. And I feel like their play here was just bad enough to where I couldn't really like see much merit to them. And I feel like with her having the least amount of pros out of anyone here, I did decide to give the award to her. Next up, we have the worst Big Brother player, and this is definitely a more interesting category. I feel like there are definitely several considerations here from both BB Can as well as BB26 here. We're starting off with the BB Can side. You have Dennis, and I feel like Dennis is someone who isn't the worst player in the world on paper, but I feel like the fact that he gets backdoored in week 3 by his own closest ally is a really bad look and definitely a consideration to put him on this list here, but not enough to win him the award here. You also have Elijah from the season, who does technically end up being the first juror. He does technically have some longevity here, but it's in a spot to where he's pretty much on the outs the entire time, has really no agency across a lot of the season, and in the end, there really just was no real merit to his game at the end of the day. But again, he does technically make it to the jury phase, and I feel like he doesn't make as many actively bad plays compared to some other people, but it's just the fact that he just has no agency. He doesn't really have many pros to his game despite his placement. That leaves him as a consideration here as well. And then moving over to BB26, I did consider Matt, again, the first boot of the season, someone who really does bring it upon himself, where he does like try to like use the pantry room as his personal HOH room. You have him trying to target Angela in a spot to where Angela's the HOH. You have him pushing away allies like Tucker and Joseph. That makes him like a pretty easy person to take out here. And really, there's just no reason for him to be the first boot. But I feel like he's not the worst of the options here. And then the other nominee was Kenny, who obviously sucks at the end of the day, someone who wanted to quit the game, someone who really didn't really have too much traction in large part because he wanted to quit the game. But I do feel like there's at least some pros to him outside the fact that he wanted to quit the game. And I feel like had he had his head more in the game, he could have done reasonably well. But at the end of the day, not really much to say that's positive here. But in the end, I decided to give the award to the BB26 side. And that person is Lisa, the second boot of the season. And I feel like Lisa is someone who I would have a lot less faith in on any given season compared to Matt. And I feel like still plays pretty actively bad for the most part here, where you have her being a target in week 1 due to her having these 101s after being picked for the veto. You also have her like really getting on a lot of people's nerves during a lot of that week. You have her telling Angela that she can't associate with her inside or outside the game. You have people thinking that she has a power even though she didn't even play in the upgrade power comp. And she's just such an easy person to take out in week 2 that there really isn't much to praise with Lisa here. And I feel like she arguably played as actively bad as Matt at the end of the day here. And with her being someone who I wouldn't have a lot of faith in to begin with, I feel like considering the debate between Matt and Lisa, I feel like there's enough actively bad with Lisa mixing in with her lack of potential in any given season to where I decided to give the award to her. And bringing these two awards together, we have the Gumball Worst Player of the Year award. And really the two options here are Jessica and Lisa. And I decided to give the award to Lisa here, where I feel like Jessica at least has the pro of surviving a tribal. She does technically have people on her side during that first round, even though I feel like it's more so due to things happening around her than people actually caring about Jessica in the game, where Lisa literally never survives around a gameplay without some sort of immunity, where she probably would have been gone in week 1 had she not won the veto there. And I feel like there are just so many things she does wrong to bring about a boot here that I feel like she's clearly the choice for this award. Next up, we have the Most Robbed Pre-Juror Award, and I feel like there are definitely some considerations for this one here. Where first up, from Australian Survivor, we do have Eden. I feel like Eden played a pretty strong game for the most part here. Definitely was one of the better players across a lot of that season here, only for him to be taken out in the last round of the pre-jury phase, which was a pretty late pre-jury, by the way, where he was the third boot after the merge. So the fact that he was only a pre-juror here is kind of noteworthy here. Not to mention that he was taken out in a split tribal where there was a tie and there could have been a rock draw potentially, only for Jaden to flip at the last second for seemingly no reason. So I do think Eden gets kind of unlucky by that aspect to it, but not enough to be robbed per se. Next up, from Survivor 46, I did consider Randon, simply because he was this player who did pretty well for what I expected from him coming into the season, only for him to be medevaced, and he probably would have been in a pretty good spot on his tribe had he survived it, but obviously the medevac kind of got in the way of that. But again, the reason I did not go with him was, at the end of the day, he was still only the third boot of the season, and beyond that, I feel like there are other people who are more robbed than him, so I didn't give the award to him. And I also considered two people from Survivor 47, where first up you have Annika, who I do think was taken out in somewhat weird circumstances where she had lost her vote from the journey, and also you have Andy having the amulet from his journey. that kind of made it very hard for her to actually survive the round she was taken out in. But considering what we heard after the season about how Sierra would have sided against her anyway, I feel like it wasn't enough to make her a robbed pre-juror, but she was at least a consideration. And then the final nominee was Tiana, also from 47, who I think was also taken out in a very unfortunate situation here, where she was taken out in the last round of the pre-jury in a spot to where there was this clear target coming into the tribal in Rachel, only for Rachel to literally be saved at the very last second. Sort of made it so that Tiana didn't really have much time to really save herself here. But the reason I didn't go with her was she would have been voted out in the pre-merge had they ever gone back to tribal anyway. And I feel like the tribal we saw in which she was taken out was simply what would have happened had Tugu ever lost an immunity challenge again. So I feel like for those reasons, I couldn't quite consider her robbed, but again, she was pretty close there. But in the end, I decided to give this award to Charles from Australian Survivor. And I feel like Charles gets really screwed over in the round he gets taken out in, where he came into the swap in a pretty good position where he was part of the majority there. He was part of the majority to take out Garrick at that first tribal and seemed to be in a pretty good spot coming into that next round, only for him to get completely shafted by the format of this particular round, where only 3 people would be able to vote, and that vote was decided purely by a challenge. And while I can't say that this came completely out of left field, where they had just done a similar tribal last season with the Fraser round, I still think this is a very luck-dependent round where a lot of it is determined by the actual challenge. And Charles literally gets the worst possible situation here, where both Ferris and Eileen win that challenge, ensuring that they have control over what happens with the actual vote. And considering that Winna had an idol to play as well, it just further incentivized him to take a shot at Charles, someone who was unlikely to have an idol plan on him to begin with. And sure enough, Charles is taken out in this very unfortunate situation here, where I feel like Charles was pretty clearly the option to be taken out based off the way the tribal played out, based on the people who were voting. And there was just nothing that Charles could do to get out of the situation. So I feel like Charles did the least amount of wrong to be the boot in this round, while still getting royally screwed over by the actual format of the round, to where for me, he was a pretty clear choice for this award. Next up, we had the Most Robbed Juror Award, and unlike the Robbed Pre-Juror Award, I feel like there weren't as many options for this award, simply because I feel like there weren't many post-jurors who were that screwed over at the end of the day, to where I really only had 2 considerations for this actual award here. Now talking about the person who did not get the award, I did consider Valeria from Australian Survivor, simply due to the round where she was taken out by a single vote in a situation to where Raymond had convinced the rest of the tribe that he was about to quit the game. And obviously, while this was a whole ploy to draw the votes onto him so that he could play his idol successfully, I still think the way Valeria gets taken out here is kind of wonky. But at the end of the day, I feel like Valeria was still not in the greatest spot to win the game, even if she had survived the round. And even with like the whole play to draw the votes onto Raymond, I feel like she still could have done things to get out of the situation, where she did consider splitting the vote anyway, only to not do so. So I feel like for that reason, I couldn't consider her robbed to where she did not get the nod. But in the end, I did decide to give this award to Andy from Survivor 47. Now, at the end of the day, is Andy really that robbed? I'm not entirely sure. I still think there are things he could have done differently to avoid having the target on him specifically, but I still think the round he gets taken out in is a bit of an unfortunate one, where he was in a spot to where he had flipped over Teeny to ensure that he had the majority for the following round, and had this clear plan of targeting Rachel, and once Rachel did not win immunity, it seemed like he was about to get his way and taking out Rachel there. And obviously, while there are things that he did that are kind of questionable, like him telling Rachel that he was going to vote for her, it was in a spot to where he didn't think the target was going to land on him specifically, and even then, he still was able to get the majority of the votes onto him anyway, to where he is technically idle out of the game here. Now, at the end of the day, I feel like Andy is by far not the most robbed person in Survivor history by any means, but I feel like considering how there weren't that many rounds of post-merge play that were that wonky or led to people being that screwed over, I feel like it was good enough to give Andy the award here, even though he's not the greatest option in the world. But now we're finally getting to the big ticket awards, starting off with the Survivor Player of the Year. And there were definitely several nominees for this award here, where first up you have Charlie from 46. I feel like Charlie played a pretty strong game, a pretty dominant game for the most part, and a game that was debatably a winning one, where he came very close to winning, just 1 vote away from ensuring a tie, where he would have won that tiebreaker. And I feel like there are very few holes within Charlie's game to where I am very impressed by Charlie's game, but at the end of the day, he did not win, so I feel like that was kind of a ding against him there. Next up from 47, I did consider Genevieve, who I feel like is a pretty consistent player, someone who I would have plenty of faith in on any given season. Now, I still have criticisms with her game, like her whole Saul move and her mismanaging her threat level, but I still feel like she is one of the stronger players to come out of this year, and definitely in consideration. But kind of similar to Charlie, she did not end up winning her season, so couldn't quite go with her there. Next up, we have Rachel, the winner of 47. And while I have plenty of complaints with Rachel's winning game, I still feel like she is a strong player, someone who I think has plenty of skills for the game and definitely has some interesting moments here and there, like her whole shot in the dark play. You have her winning challenges. I think there's definitely things to prop up with Rachel, and she's definitely someone who I would be interested to see play on 50 to see how consistent of a player she is. But at the end of the day, I feel like her winning game is just really messy to where I couldn't give her the award because of that. Any other person I considered but did not give the award to was Kirby from Australian Survivor. And I think Kirby's a really fascinating player to say the least, someone who is really aggressive and willing to make moves that very few players are willing to make, and is still someone who did pretty well, got all the way to the final five. Probably would have won had she gotten to the end, considering how she was able to cultivate all these relationships along the way, and someone who I'd be very fascinated to see on a return. But sort of similar to these other non-winning players, I think the fact that she did not win the game makes it hard for her to get the award over someone who did win the game, so for those reasons I did not give her the award. But with all that out of the way, the Survivor Player of the Year is Ferris, the winner of Australian Survivor Titans vs Rebels. And I really like Ferris. I feel like Ferris played a pretty strong winning game. Now, obviously, there are some holes along the way, and there are definitely points where he gets lucky at points, but I still find Ferris to be a very strong all-around player, someone who was willing to make pretty interesting moves along the way, working alongside Raymond for a lot of it, being able to have this rivalry with Kirby, but still being able to work with them in the post-merge. And I feel like he wins in pretty dominant fashion, winning in a 9-0 jury vote. And I feel like there are plenty of impressive elements to Ferris's game that makes him the clear choice for this award. And moving over to the Big Brother Player of the Year, there were really only 3 considerations for this award here. But starting off with Bailey, the winner of Big Brother Canada 12, and admittedly, despite her winning in somewhat impressive fashion, she was actually the 3rd place finisher for this award here. Now, I do think Bailey has some impressive elements to her game. The fact that she was starting from the bottom, but was able to work her way back into the majority, and was eventually able to take down Anthony at the end is somewhat impressive. Now, at the end of the day, I do question how intentional a lot of her game is, where I think there are definitely points where Bailey was definitely aloof to what was happening and was doing things for seemingly the wrong reasons, but it kind of paid off for her anyway. So while I don't think Bailey is the strongest player in the world, the fact that she won the season was at least worthy consideration, but did not give her the award at the end of the day. And the other person I considered was Anthony Douglas, the runner-up of the season. And obviously, Anthony has really solidified himself as one of the greatest BB Can players of all time. The fact that he came back after playing a pretty impressive game on BB Can 7, only for him to play another pretty strong game and get to the end again, is all really impressive. And I feel like the fact that he loses is a bit unfortunate, as I feel like a lot of the jury was against him for a lot of it. I feel like there wasn't really that much he could have done to win a jury vote by the end of it. But I still feel like Anthony played a really impressive game. The fact that he really cemented himself as one of the best BB Can players ever is really worthy of consideration here. But sort of similar to the Survivor Player of the Year award, I feel like the fact that he did not ultimately win the season is a big reason why I did not give him the award, to where had he gone on to win the season, he probably would have won the award if I'm being honest, but the fact that he lost and the fact that there was a player who was better than him was enough to leave him out of this conversation. But with all that out of the way, the Big Brother Player of the Year is Chelsea from BB26. Now, admittedly, I do have some nitpicks with Chelsea's game. I feel like the fact that she kind of went back and forth across a lot of the season, the fact that she kind of wavered with certain decisions isn't the greatest look at the end of the day, but I feel like that doesn't take away from how dominant of a game Chelsea played across the season, where it really feels like she had the game locked down from relatively early on. Now, while there was a point where she was towards the bottom, I feel like she recovered from that situation very well. And in the end, she ends up playing a perfect game, being able to win in a 7-0 jury vote after not getting any jury votes against her herself. Only the 3rd player in BBUS to accomplish this feat is really impressive. And the fact that she just had the game completely locked down from, the final 7 on is pretty impressive in my eyes. The fact that she was able to completely manipulate MJ into taking her to the end, really just clowning on MJ during the final jury questioning. Again, I feel like there are a lot of really impressive elements to Chelsea's game. The fact that she played a pretty impressive, dominant winning game is a major consideration for her, and the fact that she actually won in this fashion compared to Anthony, who lost, was a big reason why I gave her the award over Anthony here. And with that, we get to our final award, that being the Gumball Player of the Year award. And really, there were only two nominees for this, that being Ferris and Chelsea. But I feel like there's a pretty clear choice for me. And with that, the 2024 Gumball Player of the Year award goes to Chelsea. I feel like Chelsea played a cleaner game compared to Ferris, where I feel like Ferris definitely relied more on luck at certain points, like that Charles travel I mentioned earlier. And obviously the fact that he kind of had to win final immunity at the end to secure a spot there. I feel like those things kind of drag Ferris down a bit. Whereas I feel like Chelsea's game is a lot cleaner in my eyes. Now, yes, there's like the wavering back and forth and the week where she was at the bottom, but I feel like in general, Chelsea's game was a bit more consistent compared to Ferris's. The fact that Chelsea had a much smoother ride to the end compared to Ferris, where she had a lot of people that are willing to take her deep, and the fact that she just completely demolishes the jury vote at the end. I feel like there are so many pros for Chelsea over Ferris for me that makes her the clear choice for the Player of the Year award. But there we go, that'll do it for this week's video and the last video of 2024. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps with the channel. Now, obviously, there's going to be a bunch of stuff coming the new year. There's going to be a bunch of new seasons coming out, like Australian Survivor, 2 seasons of Australian Survivor, in fact. You got The Traders, you have more Hell's Kitchen, you have 2 more seasons of Survivor US coming your way, and obviously other general videos coming out, so stay tuned for all that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.